Hello everyone and welcome to another comic book video. So, as I mentioned previously, I'm only doing about a video about once a month for the summer. And someone actually asked me if I could talk a little bit more about the Golden Age. I did a video probably about a year ago where I briefly talked about the Golden Age of comics, that time period from the very late 1930s to the 1940s up into the mid 1950s. So I thought today I would go ahead and do that and just cover a little more information and stuff about that. But before we can really talk about the Golden Age, we have to talk about the Platinum Age. So the Platinum Age is this very interesting part of comic book history that began in 1897 and ran up to about 1938. So for Platinum Age, this is when you start seeing the different ideas, the different designs and stuff start coalescing together to become what we consider the modern comic book. So the reason why 1897 is picked was because that was the first time you had a book solely printed of comic strips. So around this time, of course, in the 1800s, you had newspapers were trying to attract more readers. So one of the things they started doing was adding the funnies or comic strips to their newspapers and stuff. In 1897, there was actually a book release that was featuring old previous strips of a character called the Yellow Kid. Now, just to verify, the Yellow Kid was not based on anything with like ethnicity or anything like that. It was just a young kid who wore this very long yellow flannel nightgown in the series. So he was called the Yellow Kid because of the long nightgown, and also the strip was a lot of times a pun on what was considered yellow journalism or sensationalist news. So, but this was the first time in 1897 where a book was released just featuring all strips just with that character, because that's kind of how it began. So through that time period, you had the 1910s, 20s, even into the 30s. You started having like little books coming out with different designs and stuff featuring comic strips from the newspapers, and they were mostly just reprints. So, and also around this time period, you have really what was called the rise of pulp fiction, which was usually these books that were made on very cheap paper. They weren't made to last or anything, and they weren't considered very educational reading. So a lot of early like crime stories, fantasy, science fiction, and other different genres come from these early pulp books. And you also had some of the very first kind of superheroes or heroes during this time period, such as like Flash Gordon or The Shadow. And so this was going on pretty much during that time period. And so we actually eventually get to what was I consider the very first comic book was published in about 1933 and was called Famous Funnies, A Carnival of Comics. And it was, of course, just the same thing where it was just reprinting popular strips that had appeared in the newspapers. Some of the ones it featured was such as Mutt and Jeff, Joe Palooka, other famous characters as well. Now, in May 1934, Famous Spot Funnies released a #1 issue and started a series, and this was kind of what's really started what we consider the comic book industry, though, of course, at the time, it still was just doing reprints of comic strips. Now, in 1934 as well, though, a new series came out called New Fun Comics, and this was released by a company that would later become what we would consider DC Comics. So, and the reason why they actually did new content was they wouldn't have to pay the rights to a newspaper to get the rights to a comic, to the strips, to do reprints or anything. It was actually cheaper for them to actually hire artists and writers to do brand new characters and brand new stories than it was to try and get the rights from these newspapers. So for those first, so for the very end of the Platinum Age is when you start really seeing what we consider comics come out. And of course, you did also start having superheroes being slowly introduced. For instance, one of the first ones was a character called Dr. Occult, who was actually made by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, who, of course, who ended up creating Superman as well. He was actually one of the first superheroes, was this Dr. Occult. And then in 1938, Detective Comics Inc., where we actually get the detective, we get the DC from, is actually Detective Comics Inc., published, of course, Action Comics #1, first appearance of Superman, and the industry just exploded. Just a lot of popularity with the character. The character really took off. So that's when you started seeing a lot of other superheroes come out as well. And before I go on, I wanted to just show a couple things. I have a couple printouts of just to show you some of these comics I'm talking about. So this is Famous Funnies #1, released in 1934. It's the first issue of that long-running Famous Funnies series. So this is kind of like the first ongoing. It's not often considered the first comic book, but it's considered the first comic in an ongoing series. So I included that one as there. And then, of course, Action Comics #1, very first appearance of Superman, and which also very easily sells for anywhere from $500,000 to over $1 million. Probably the most expensive comic in the industry. Okay, and so with the introduction of Superman, superheroes just explode. You have a lot of new companies trying to get into the industry, starting up, trying to new superheroes will be introduced. Some, of course, we still remember today, such as Captain America and Wonder Woman were introduced during this time period. You also had the original Captain Marvel, who we now call Shazam because of copyright reasons as well. And, of course, there was other characters who you may not know as well, such as like the Black Terror. The original Daredevil was actually from this time period as well. So just some different characters as well. So, and then of course during World War II, superheroes and comics really on the forefront, really promoting the war effort, things like that. They did stories where you would see the superheroes going over into Europe fighting the Nazis or something like that. So it was a very much, the comics really got into the whole war effort as well. Now, by the end of the war, though, superheroes actually started losing popularity. People weren't as interested in the superheroes anymore, and certain other genres really came more to the forefront. From there, you had genres such as the horror, the crime, romance, funny animals, westerns. Now, while some of these were really have been around beforehand, this was kind of that time period where they really took off. The problem with that was, as some of these comic book companies were trying to attract new readers and stuff, they started really upping, I guess you could say, the ante a little bit. The comics became a lot more violent. They introduced a lot more adult themes, especially like some of the horror and crime ones. And it ended up causing a bit of a backlash from parents, public officials, stuff like that, who were viewing comic books as helping to lead to child delinquency. The reason they came to this conclusion is, of course, comics were a very popular form of entertainment for kids at the time, so a lot of the kids who were getting in trouble, committing crimes or something, all admitted that they read comic books. So they assumed, oh, it must be the comic books that are causing this problem. So, and then this really came to the forefront in 1954 when you had a psychiatrist named Friedrich Wertham released a book called Seduction of the Innocent. And in this book, he argued that comic books were a main contributor to juvenile delinquency, and he cited their various psychiatric cases. Plus, he also concluded various panels or some from various comics that had come out. This led to even the book became like a minor hit in the publishing industry. People were reading it. It even led to hearings in Congress on juvenile delinquency, and they were calling up various people and investigating. The head of EC Comics at the time was called up to testify because EC was kind of the ones who was viewed as again the forefront of these more gory or more adult comics. The hearing did not go too well. Even the head of EC mentioned that at the time. He was not well prepared. He had not slept well, so he was kind of tired and stuff. And so he did not, he did not present a very good defense of, of comics. So eventually, in order to, what they considered save the industry, the comic book companies got together and started the Comics Code Authority, which was going to be an entity that would pretty much censor any comic book materials that they thought was inappropriate for kids. So pretty much the comic book companies agreed to self-censor themselves. And this kind of led to kind of the industry started dying out because of this. Several companies who had folded along this time. You had such as Fawcett, which was the original creator of Shazam or Captain Marvel. You also have Lev Gleason Publications, who did some early superhero work and stuff. So very much it was by the mid-1950s, the comic book industry, which had been very popular and at its height in the early 40s, was on the verge of decline. So that's kind of where we end with the Golden Age, and I brought in some Golden Age comics to show you. First one I have is actually an issue of Famous Funnies from that first real long-running series. This is issue 158. It came out in 1947. And of course, this just featured characters who were in the various comic strips. Like this one had a character called Invisible Scarlet O'Neil, who was a woman who fought crime but could turn herself invisible, kind of like an early version of the Invisible Woman. You also had another character called Napoleon, which was a strip that was about a giant dog type thing. So just some of the very early comic strips and stories that were featured there. Next one I have is actually one I really like in my collection. This is Master Comics 89 from 1948 by Fawcett Comics, and it features Captain Marvel Jr. One of the things they did early on with the Marvel family there was that they went ahead and was adding new. They introduced Captain Marvel, but then they started growing what they would end up calling the family. Mary Marvel, Captain Marvel Jr. was part of that. But a lot of the early Golden Age comics too were anthologies, so they just didn't have one character or just one story. They had multiple characters and multiple stories. For instance, the main one for this series, of course, the headline of the title was Captain Marvel Jr., but you also had other genres such as a Western story in here, a jungle story, another superhero, Bullet Man, was also in this as well. So it was just an anthology, but series. Next, I have a Classics Illustrated Sherlock Holmes. So Classics Illustrated was actually a company that did comics, but they did it on various classic stories. So, for instance, anything, stuff like Mark Twain, or Charles Dickens, or Sir Arthur Conan Doyle is the case of Sherlock Holmes, and they just took them and made a comic book adaptation of them. They actually did some fairly good adaptations. Of course, I'm a big Sherlock Holmes fan, so I was proud to be able to get this one. Plus, the Sherlock Holmes ones are actually kind of hard to find. They didn't do as many reprints of them as they did with some of the other titles. So, but I have that as well. Next, I actually have a crime comic here. Crime and Punishment 20 from 1949. And also, I want to note the cover there. A beautiful cover by one of the great Golden Age comic artists at the time, Charles Biro, with just a very nice cover. And this is even one of his more well-known or more famous covers, but still just a nice cover. So, and then the final one I actually have is actually a war comic from 1956. So this came out just before Showcase 4, which kind of started the Silver Age. This came out just right before that, so it's still the very, very tail end of the Golden Age. And it's Black Hawks 99. The Black Hawk was a war comic series. It started in World War II and actually continued well into the Silver Age as well. But it was just a group of fighters who flew airplanes originally against the Nazis and the Japanese. But as time went on, they were also fighting other different villains and groups and stuff as well. But just a nice cover as well. And that's kind of what I have today on the Golden Age. So I hope you enjoyed this video. And if you do, just go ahead and give it a like. And I will see you next month. Bye.